Today we're here with Daniel Bustamante, the Executive Director of the Greater Houston Fair Housing Center. Mr. Bustamante is a force in fair housing and has worked for almost 2 decades in civil rights and fair housing here in Houston and at a national level. How do you explain to people what you do?
I tell people that I'm trying to protect their fair housing rights. Your fair housing rights are protected by the Federal Fair Housing Act and the Texas Fair Housing Act. Certain protected classes, there's 7 of them: race, color, religion, sex, national origin, familial status, and disability. And if you're a member of that protected class, you're protected under the law for any differential treatment that you might receive.
How did you get interested in fair housing issues?
Born and raised by my grandparents. My first language is Spanish. The first day of school in a little rural South Texas community, I went to a Mexican school. It was only intended to house Mexicans who didn't speak English. It was a segregated school system. My grandfather, who was an active person in that small rural community, so I always saw him fight for justice. The simplest thing I could do as a child at 6 years old was to run away from the teacher with a stick in her hand, and I ran out with a bunch of friends and we hid in the swamps all day. And then I come home and I was worried my grandfather was going to be upset. He was so upset, not at me, but at what had happened, that he got his brother, who was active in the school board, to get me in the real school. I'll never forget the first day of school. I had what I thought was the meanest school teacher I'd ever run into. Years later, I was here in Houston. I was meeting a retired federal judge, De Anda, and I told him that story and told me that that lady that I had for first grade was the most racist superintendent of schools in South Texas, and they had to go after her in 1954 to desegregate that part of Texas. And I'm a product of integration. And I was here for the desegregation of housing. The whole stuff happened in the 1970s that was civil rights oriented. And as a student at the University of Houston, along with my peers at TSU and all the other schools, we fought alongside to try to bring equality to our circles.
How has fair housing evolved in Houston over time?
The most important thing is the awareness has been built. We first started our operation in September of '99. We were the only fair housing entity in Houston. Probably every single jurisdiction and housing authority in our region has some kind of component for fair housing. If they don't have one, they need to get one. Under federal law, there's a lot of jurisdictions and housing authorities and recipients of federal money that have not been in compliance with the law. And it's basically a lack of awareness. So I think the most critical thing is that the awareness level has increased, and we strive real hard to educate the public and also the housing providers in terms of their responsibilities and how they should behave when they're treated people. So I think the awareness building is the most critical thing to me, because unless people know that they have a right to a law and to a defense of some sort, they won't look for help. And if somebody's hungry for justice, they need to look for some kind of freedom and liberation from the oppressive, environments that they're in. Shouldn't have to go through the stuff that people go through in our community. Because that brings enforcement, and you can't get enforcement unless people are aware. I think the biggest frustration is there's not enough enforcement. And we're a big boom town, and we're booming and have never stopped booming. We're at 7 million plus in the metro area, and it's not going to stop. And housing is going to continue to be needed.
What are the biggest fair housing issues you see in Houston?
In Houston, we're a renter community. The demographics of that is more people of color rent. As you go down in the income levels, the equity that's built by homeowners is just not there. We're still basically segregated by economy. Depends on where you live. Where you live is where you can afford. Fair housing is a law that guarantees you equality in housing if you can afford it. So people are automatically priced out of a nicer house in the nicer parts of town because of the cost. And that's a real clear indicator that's been out there for decades. The only way to get around that is that people need to get paid a just wage. And all of you know families that are working 2 or 3, 4 jobs just to pay the rent, to buy food. And now with this pandemic and the crisis we're under, it's become more and more challenging to fight discrimination because people don't have the ability to complain. Families with children and people with disabilities are the 2 most oppressed, taken advantage of groups. I think one of the things that moves all of us that work in civil rights and in community services, we need to try to figure out how to better bring needed services and help to communities that are in danger of suffering. The homeless population, and specifically their needs as people that don't have homes, I think is critical. Once in a while we'll see the roundups, homeless people being moved from streets, but they have to go somewhere. That's another concern because that brings other issues in public health.
What do you wish everyone knew about fair housing?
That everybody who's physically in our country, whether you're documented or undocumented, legal or illegal, don't understand English, don't speak the language or understand the customs, you are covered by the Federal Fair Housing Act. You cannot be segregated into housing that you don't need to be in. You cannot be given inferior housing. If you're getting it at the expense of your ethnicity or your protected basis, you should be treated the same. Laws are good. It's just the enforcement and the interpretation of those laws that creates the barrier. But we need people that are trying to get the system to work correctly. Especially the city of Houston is such a dynamic, beautiful city. I always tell everybody it's the greatest city in the world, that we just haven't arrived. And they ask me, well, what's going to take to arrive? I said, well, we have equity. We have equity in everything, in housing, education, and criminal justice, employment. But I like the challenge of, I think we're never going to arrive. That's what the response usually is. But we're not a perfect country. We're not a perfect society. But we have to see our problems, look them in the face, collaboratively work with each other, and figure out a way to better do what we do and reach as many people as we can with the resources we have. So I'm always looking for partners. The city has been a great partner of ours. That's a critical element. Education in these areas is critical. Not everybody is social media. Not everybody can use technology. Not everybody can afford it. I'm old school enough to know that it will take many times a personal visit to somebody or a presentation of some sort to reach people. And so whatever it takes, we just have to be able to do it.
What government policy would you change to help promote housing fairness or equity in Houston?
One thing that I wish I could change is the law that requires, under the Texas Property Code, every rental property to be habitable. Somebody can live there without being in danger. Landlords will charge whatever rent they charge and force people to live in units that are not habitable. The justice of the peace system does not go after the landlords for having a unit that's not habitable. And it's a huge frustration, I think, to all of us in the movement to have to tell people that there's nothing we can do about your habitability of your unit that you're being evicted from, and you're concerned about housing and maybe you don't want to pay rent because it's mold and mildew and the landlord won't fix it. We force people to live in housing that's dangerous. A lot of these folks are disabled, their families with children, seniors, people that don't have the resources to do anything but live there. So this contributes then to the need for health care. Kids have to go to school with not having a good evening at home, sleeping or resting because of the conditions of their housing. I can't tell you the number of times every year we wind up going to communities that are trailer parks or low-income housing, and people are just desperate. And we have to tell them there's no discrimination going on because they're doing it to everybody. Cities, jurisdictions in our area need to do a better job of enforcing codes. So I wish if I could change anything to make those codes that require jurisdictions to keep housing fit. And we're booming, and Houston's going to keep on booming. We're not going to go anywhere but up. And more people and more traffic and more houses. And the most important thing to me is making sure that we engage people, communities, that we reach out to the persons with disability, to the families with children, and to all the folks that are potentially being made to suffer, and show them how they can better their situation, first by making the right complaints at the right place, but also reaching out to their elected officials and to their community leaders and expressing themselves so they get to be part of the solution. A lot of times discrimination is unintentional, but that's no excuse. If it's there, we need to identify it, figure out how to best correct it, and move on. Women, single moms especially, there's an issue in our community right now with sexual harassment. During the pandemic, it's happened more. So I'm very concerned about people that are being sexually harassed, of course, of living in rental housing or other housing, and the people with disabilities. And so I know that there's thousands of people that are going to hear what we're saying about fair housing that cannot go to the computers, cannot make a complaint online for some reason of disability. It's really critical that our faith-based organizations, our community-based organizations are aware of what we're talking about. They're in a position to educate their communities, because the more awareness we build, the more pressure we can put on authority to get engaged. We're in a great city. There's a lot of us and there's a lot of work to do. The commitment from our elected officials is there. Let's just translate that into collaborative that's going to engage all of us and put us all on the same page.
What are you most proud of in your fair housing work?
I think just being part of the chain of what I've been talking about, being able to say I'm a link in that chain, because it doesn't start with us. It started with somebody else. It could be a family member, but in a lot of our cases, I'm just blessed, but I'm just proud to be part of the fight. part of that battle for justice and civil rights. I grew up in the era of Dr. King, especially the 60s. I think that ingrained in me ever since the assassination of John Kennedy, what I wanted to do. And I was just 12, 13 years old when that happened. Then Dr. King's assassination and Senator Kennedy's assassination the same year, and a lot of other civil rights leaders. I was already old enough to understand what was going on. So a lot of us decided that we just needed to do as much as we can. I have energy, a desire to continue my work, so I'm going to do it as long as I can.
To continue the conversation, please visit houstontx.gov/fair-housing for more information or check out our Facebook page.